Hello and welcome to the Carteret Cast, the podcast for everything Carteret County. I'm super excited to be here with Mr. Bob Guthrie today to talk a little more about World War II and its effects on Carteret County. So, Mr. Bob, if you want to start.
Okay. First thing I'd like to mention is we have exhibits here in the museum that I'd like to draw to people's attention. We maintain a section of the museum as a veterans memorial. And if people will bring us the information, we keep files on people who are veterans, and we like to have pictures of them, and we like to know something about their lives. The exhibit is organized according to the different wars that have we've been involved with. It goes all the way back to, of course, the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and of course, we don't have that much information there. But starting with World War I and World War II, we do have quite a few people who've brought us information. We keep notebooks that people can look through and actually see pictures of those people who were involved in the war. Also, we have a memorabilia section. Part of the collection is patches from World War II that were collected by a Ward City lady whose name was Mary Arundel Street, so she was connected to the founding family of Morehead City. And she worked at the USO. We got a USO building here in Morehead City just before the war started, because they were building Cherry Point, they were building Camp Lejeune, they were building an Air Force base at Goldsboro. It was in the Army Air Corps then. There was no Air Force. And the Navy was expanding into Carteret County, and the Coast Guard was expanding too. So they built a USO, and on the weekends, they had dances and programs there. So a lot of the people who were in the military came down for that. It was sort of like a canteen, a place where they could, relax. And she befriended a lot of the people who were there, and they repaid her by sending her patches during the war. I played with those patches as a child. The Arundels lived a half a block from my grandmother Harold's house. And so I was there all the time, and I played with them a lot. And when I graduated from high school, Mary called my mother, and she said, "I want you and Bob to come to the house. I've got something I'm going to give him for graduation." And when we got there, she had packaged up all 2,000 of those patches. I was blown away. And I said, "Mary, I can't take your patches." And she laughed. She said, "Well, I'm not going to live forever. And I can't think of anybody who loves these patches any more than you do. And I know you'll take care of them." And I did. And I used them when I was an educator. And then later I decided to give them to the museum. But I also wanted her to be remembered, so they're under her name. These patches are under her name. And they're very interesting patches. They're all from World War II, and a lot of them are divisional patches. And they refer to groups in the Army that were organized. About 10,000 to 12,000 men are organized into a division. That became sort of the major unit of the war. Several divisions might be put into an army. Several armies might be put into an army group. And that's the way armies were organized during the war. So I like for people to get a chance to see these patches. So it is a good idea to come into the museum. We'd be happy to show those to you. The other thing I thought we would talk about today is the effects that the armed forces had on Carteret County, and the way Carteret County was changed as a result of that, and the way that life for the average individuals were changed. And of course, permanently, some of the people who came to Carteret County stayed in Carteret County. We talk about the reason why these people were exposed to Carteret County is because in World War I, the Army was activated according to national or state militias. They were nationalized. So basically, the units in the armed forces then were all from the same general area of the country. A lot of times they were from the same town. But for World War II, they decided the Army was not going to be organized that way. At first, they were activated. The state militias were activated. But after that, 15 million men went into the military. And so most of them were new divisions for the Army. The Navy almost always had been organized differently. The people in there were mixed up from all over the country, were put together. But the Army, not so much. Now the Army was going to be organized in that same way, that people from all around the country would be in one unit. So that meant that certain families arrived in Carteret County, and stayed in Carteret County, and they had unusual names, not Carteret County names. As I have mentioned to you, the most prominent Carteret County name, I won't say prominent, the most prevalent, the one that's the greatest number, is Willis. There are more Willises than any other. And then Lewises are second, and Guthries are third. But then you start getting names that were not Carteret County names, like Ditto, D-I-T-T-O, and Galantis, that's a Greek name, and Marino, that is an Italian name. Then you had Sokolowski, Cassiano, Femia, Economan, Sledge. And if you get a telephone book from the 1960s and open it up, you can see who are the Carteret County people, because those names are repeated. And the ones that aren't Carteret County people, that now are Carteret County people, are some of these unusual names. It's a good thing. And I want people to understand that. My personal belief is all visitors to Carteret County are welcome. And if you want to stay here, that's a good thing too. So the idea that everybody is a tourist, no. If you want to become a person from Carteret County, we'll be happy to have you to join us here. The other thing that I'd like to talk about for a while is that the life of people in Carteret County was changed by the war. I'm going to mention quite a few of them, and then I'll come back and talk about each one. Rationing of food, that affected everybody. My mother had a ration book that I have a copy of it. And I was affected by a picture that my father had taken when he was in the Navy on Iceland. And it was of a canteen that served food to the men in the Navy and the Army and the Marines. And it says, soldiers, sailors, and airmen, take all the food you want, but eat all the food you take. Remember, food is rationed at home for your families so that you can have all you need to fight this war. I was kind of affected by that because that particular day I had an argument with my grandmother about food that was on my plate that I didn't particularly want to eat. And she mentioned that there were starving children in China and India, and I kind of sassed her and said we ought to send it to them. I didn't ever do that again, but seeing what I saw in that picture made me aware of the fact that people in civilian life just couldn't have all the food they wanted. And some food became very, very scarce. Fats became scarce because glycerin is made from fat, and glycerin is a component of nitroglycerin, and nitroglycerin is an explosive that is used to make other explosives. And of course, war is all about dropping explosives on the enemy. Mm-hmm. So If you liked bacon grease, you weren't going to get much bacon grease because it was going to be used by the military to make munitions. Other than that, rationing sometimes meant that people would have to cooperate with one another. Like sugar. Sugar was rationed. You couldn't just have all the sugar you wanted. Well, if you needed more sugar, like let's say someone in your family was going to have a birthday, and you had a couple of other families close by you, and they didn't need their rationing of sugar for that particular month. You could do a deal with them. You could say, okay, if you'll give me some sugar now, I will replace it later. And so it meant that you couldn't always have the resources that you needed to make things. So rationing extended beyond just food because gasoline was also rationed. The military needed gasoline to fight the war, and they needed fuel oil for the Navy, and they needed aviation fuel, and so gasoline was rationed heavily. One or two groups actually got all the gas they wanted. If you were running a bus service, you got pretty much all the gas you wanted because that was cheaper than having everybody drive if people used the bus. Taxis also had pretty much an unlimited supply because they could carry people around more efficiently than everybody driving their own. Rationing also applied to things like tires. So my grandfather had 2 cars. My grandfather Guthrie had 2 cars, and he took the tires off of one and stored them in the garage because he knew eventually he would need to replace the tires on the car he used, and he would be able to do that. He also siphoned the gas out of one car that it wasn't going to use, so he could use that in the other car. A lot of other things were rationed too, and I don't really, it would be impossible to name them all, but there was one that really did sort of stick out, and that was automobiles. Now, I won't say automobiles were rationed, but every major manufacturer in the United States of automobiles or of any big equipment stopped making what they were making and started making Jeeps and tanks and airplanes and artillery pieces. So they didn't actually stop making all vehicles, but the vehicles that they did make were taken by the military. If a vehicle is going to be belong to the Army, it was painted olive green. If it was going to belong to the Navy, it was painted battleship gray. So if you saw a car going around and it was olive green, the Army was driving that car. If you saw a car going around that was battleship gray, the Navy was driving that car. Okay? And occasionally, it would mean heartbreak for some people, and there's a reason for that. If you had people from your family in the military, and they were casualties of war, they would either get a telegram, or they would get a letter, or they would get an actual visit from people in the military. So if a olive green car pulled up at your house, that might not be good news. And if a boy on a bicycle wearing a Western Union hat came to your house, that meant it was a telegram, and that might not be good news either. We had a Western Union station here in Ward City. It was built beside the Hedden House on Arundel Street here in Ward City, and it was still around when I was a little boy. Mr. Norris actually ran the Western Union place, and the idea that you could get this bad news at any time sort of pervaded life. And it meant that you and your neighbors would be aware of deaths in the community. So that had a tendency to make a difference in life. Going on to something else, we have a tendency to think of time as something that doesn't change very much. We live in a time zone here in eastern North Carolina. You know what that time zone is?
The Eastern Standard.
It's the Eastern Standard Time Zone. That's correct. And we sort of like that because where we are, noon is in the central part of our district in that time zone. Noon is in the center of the district. Noontime, 12 o'clock, the sun is directly overhead. Okay. Now, war changed that. It introduced daylight saving, and it was actually, in some cases, a 2-hour shift. So if you know now what daylight saving does now, but think about maybe 2 hours instead of 1. The basic idea was it was better usage of gasoline if the time zones were changed. They usually tried to get at least 2 factory groups, 2 factory sections to operate in during daylight. They would have one that would start at daylight and end maybe in darkness, and the other would start in darkness and end in daylight. And then there would be one factory session that was completely daylight. But they found that if you were working during one of the daylight periods, usually the work was better for some reason or not. I have no idea why, but at any rate. So the time change came about. In addition to that, along the coast, we had blackouts. The coastal areas almost immediately saw U-boats arrive off our east coast and our west coast too. Not so much the Pacific, but the east coast and the Gulf Coast. And sometimes at night you could see explosions where U-boats would set ships on fire, torpedo them. And what was helping the U-boats was the fact that out there looking back towards land, there was light, and ships would be silhouetted as they would go up and down the east coast or the Gulf Coast. And this helped the Germans to be able to torpedo those ships. So one of the things that came about was all coastal areas and all cities were required to black out. You were not allowed to keep street lights on. And your car lights, you couldn't have them on. You had to paint over the car light except for a tiny little strip that would let a little bit of light through. And all houses had to have blackout curtains over all the windows and all the doors. And they actually had wardens who would go around and look to see that everything had been darkened. This did a lot to begin to prevent so much of the U-boats attacking the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. I mentioned the street lighting as well. Next, there was a tremendous influx of women in the workplace. All the men were in the war. And so if you wanted your factory to continue to produce war material or whatever they were producing, you were going to have to start hiring women to do the jobs that the men were not there to do anymore. Quite a few women went to work at Cherry Point and at Camp Lejeune. In my neighborhood, my aunt got a job in Havelock, and a cousin who was a woman got a job. She was working at Cherry Point. So it was a tremendous change in the way the workforce was allocated. I had a cousin who talked about his sister got a job working in a factory that produced airplanes. Her job was, she was so small she could crawl into the gasoline storage tank in the wing of a B-17 airplane. She could get in there, and she examined it to make sure it didn't have any holes in it. So, and she could crawl out of it after examining it. So, women did begin to take active part in the workplace, and this was a good thing. It was what the country needed to continue to be able to produce munitions. One of the titles that America received during the war was, we were called the workshop of democracy. In other words, we were the factory that produced war material for not just the United States. We were producing war material for the Soviet Union. We're producing war material for Great Britain, and any country who had a government in exile in Britain, like the French and the Belgians and the Norwegians, we were equipping their men too as well, because they were allowed to join in the Army and the Air Forces and the navies of the world, and we were producing equipment for them as well. The output was tremendous, and I point this out. At the beginning of the war in the Pacific, Japan had 15 aircraft carriers, and the United States had only 4 in the Pacific, because we had to split our fleet between the Atlantic and the Pacific. The Japanese didn't have to do that. Very quickly, one of those aircraft carriers disappeared, and now there were only 3 American aircraft carriers. The Battle of Midway, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers fought against 3 American aircraft carriers, and we prevailed. The United States prevailed. We sank all 4 of those Japanese aircraft carriers, losing only 1 of ours. Well, now that means we only have 2 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. And at one time after that, we only had 1, and it was the Enterprise. But American industrial might began to kick in. Japan was at their height of their production before the war started. The United States was still suffering from the Great Depression. But very quickly, our industrial capability came to the fore. By the end of the war, I shall tell you how many of each of the aircraft carriers. The Japanese had none. We had sunk them all, every one of them. We had also sunk almost all of the Japanese fleet, period. And we had also sunk the Japanese merchant marine, which they depended upon to bring supplies to Japan. The Japanese were starving to death at the end of the war. How many aircraft carriers did the United States have at the end of the war? 100 aircraft carriers of all types. Fleet aircraft carriers were the biggest. Escorts were the next smallest, and baby flat tops were the very smallest. The United States' entire naval fleet was over 600 ships, and we were still building them at the end of the war. Add to that the merchant ships that we built, which were sometimes called Liberty ships. The United States had well over 1,500 ships floating in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. 1,500 ships, military and non-military. So that's a considerable, increase. And we were not only producing all these ships, we were producing tanks and planes and everything else. When President Roosevelt talked about what the production was going to be for the first year, he said we were going to produce 5,000 airplanes. Everybody thought he was crazy. Well, we didn't produce 5,000 airplanes. We produced 6,000. So we were actually doing better than we were bragging about. So anyway, over and over and over again, the United States was producing the armaments that were necessary to win the war. And the Japanese had no idea that we would be able to do this, except one man, and he was one of the admirals in the Japanese Navy, and he's the one who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. And later in the war, his comment was about having started the war because he knew that he had been in America before, and he knew that we were going to be producing. But his comment was that he feared that all the attack on Pearl Harbor had done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve, meaning that we'd awakened the United States and given the United States a reason to destroy Japan. And that's exactly what happened. Several other things that came about as a result of the war. We had airplanes in Carteret County, but they were mostly belonged to the companies that had fishing fleets. And the airplanes would go out looking for schools of fish so they could tell the boats where to go to catch them. And all of these airplanes came under the control of what was known as the Civil Air Patrol. They were militarized. Now that meant that if they didn't have the proper radio, they were going to get a radio now that would connect them to the military's radio. And when they would go out looking for fish, they would also be looking for U-boats. And if they found U-boats, they were supposed to call it in. So the Civil Air Patrol brought another kind of militarization to the civilians of Carteret County. I tell a story, and my father told me this story when I was a little boy. He said not only did the airplanes get radios, but all the fishing boats got the radios too. They were really nice radios too. They were top of the line. And my father said he had a cousin who had a fishing boat, and he was going out on it, and they would go out for fish or shrimp or whatever seafood they could catch. And one day they were out there, and he was the captain, and he had a mate, and then there were 3 others on board the ship. So there were five crew. And while they were out there, it was early morning, and all of a sudden the water beside the boat began to sort of bubble and roll. And a German U-boat surfaced right next to the fishing boat. It scared the living daylights out of them, I'm sure. But anyway, immediately out on the deck came the crew of the ship with machine guns, and the captain came out on the conning tower, and he saluted my cousin, who was the captain of the fishing boat. And he said, "Sir, I wish you no harm, but I would feel a whole lot better if you move away from that radio that's beside you there on the ship." And he said, I would not like to have to hurt anybody. He introduced himself, and he said, "I'm not a Nazi. I was a member of the German Imperial Navy before, and I'm still considered myself to be a member of the German Imperial Navy. But," he said, "but now I have to take orders from the man who's running my country, and I'm getting ready to go back to Germany, so that's why we surfaced, so we can charge our batteries. And like I say, I don't mean you any harm." He actually asked my cousin if he would like to come on board the U-boat and have a tour. And my cousin said, "No, I don't think that's a good idea. If you have to, go under, submerge, I'd be a prisoner, and I don't think I'd do well going back to Germany with you. But you can come on board my ship, and I'll show you around." And he did show him around. And they were only on the surface maybe about 30 minutes or so. And they parted, and he saluted my cousin, and my cousin saluted him, and then they submerged. And immediately, my cousin went to the radio and called it in and said there was a U-boat right where we are. Another interesting change in Carteret County. We had 3 Army bases here. We had 2 Navy bases, 2 Coast Guard bases. One of the Army bases was unusual, and it was at Atlantic, North Carolina. And if you go down there and find, the base is still there. Of course, it's grown over, but the base is still there. But if you can get up close to a chain link fence, you'll see it has signs all over it that say, if you cross this fence, you will be shot. And supposedly the commander of that base, when they were being organized, he didn't really know what was going to be in the base. So he left his second in command in charge, and he went off to a meeting where they were going to explain what was going to happen. Well, while he was gone, some of the officers made arrangements to live off the base. You could do that. And when the commander came back, he called the entire base to a meeting, and he said, for the next 2 or 3 weeks, there's no liberty at all. You're on the base, and that's it. So those of you who've made arrangements to live off the base, you need to go and pay up what you owe, because you're going to be here. And then he called them all together, and he said, this is a top secret base, and there's only going to be 4 of us. There's going to be 1 in Florida. There's going to be 1 in South Carolina. There's going to be 1 in North Carolina, and that's us. And there's going to be 1 in Virginia or Maryland. It's going to be a radar base. Now, radar was a relatively new thing. The Brits had radar, and nobody else had it at first. Even the Germans didn't have it at first. And the Brits used it to help them win the Battle of Britain against the German Air Force. As soon as planes went into the air in France or in Norway, it showed up on radar. We could send, the Brits could send their planes into the air to attack these planes as they're coming into Britain. They would then land, refuel, take off again, and they could fight against the Germans who were going back to their bases. So we got, the Brits got 2 shots. So radar was a big thing, and the Germans never figured out how the Brits were using it. If you ever get a chance to see the movie The Battle of Britain, you want to see that, because it shows in the movie exactly how the Brits used their the radar was only part of it. The Observer Corps was next. And we had an Observer Corps in the United States. People were given booklets that had silhouettes of airplanes and ships. And if you observed something, you looked up in the book to see if you could match it. And then you would radio it in. So the basic idea was you getting a lot of the civilians again to help you. The radar base was connected to the Navy and to the Coast Guard section base here in Ward City, where the community college is. If a U-boat, and this is how sensitive they were, the radar had been brought to the United States, and MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had shrunk the radar sets down small and increased their power exponentially. So now the radar, if a German U-boat would be within 5 miles of the coast and its conning tower came up, it appeared on the radar scope. If it were within a mile of the coast and the periscope went up, just the periscope would appear. And they could now radio the section base for both the Coast Guard and the Navy, and PBYs, and I'll explain what a PBY is in a minute, would take off and go and try to sink that U-boat. A PBY is the closest thing we can get to it is it's either a floating plane or or a flying boat. It could land and take off from water. And the first PBYs were called Catalinas. The Brits used them too. They were magnificent. They had a crew of about 6, but they could also land on water and rescue people from a sinking ship or any, like say an airplane crashed and it had an American pilot. The PBY could fly over and he could land and save the pilot, and that was a good thing because we didn't have to train another pilot. So over and over again, the PBYs were flying in and out of Carteret County. I'm not sure that I've covered everything, but I think I've covered most of the more pertinent items that I was thinking about. But we're always on the lookout for stories that we don't have. So I encourage people who are listening, may be listening to the cast today, if you have stories that we don't have, come here and tell them to us. We'd be delighted to record them and keep them, and they can become part of the history that we preserve here. And hopefully this will be a good thing. And that should wrap up today's cast.
Yes, and I just want to thank you again for coming on, and thank everybody for listening. Bye-bye.